And here in a minute, the amazing Dr. Ijumma Garcia will tell us what today's episode is all about. But keeping with our traditions, some things from 2020 we brought forward. We're going to just take a minute to say hello. I'm Kristie.
Hi, I'm Ijumma.
I'm Isela.
And we're here to talk about race, equity, ability, all kinds of things that are necessary to be having these transformative conversations. And so part of what we do to start each one is I ask my dear friends and colleagues to ground us a little bit and to give us an agreement that will sort of help guide our conversation. So Ijumma, we'll start with you. And what agreement, and maybe even speak just a moment about what an agreement is or why we do that. And then we'll go to Isela to ground us for today's conversation.
So we have agreements. So we have a same starting space and a container to hold us. So when there is conflict or there is misunderstanding, and also to people to feel safer in our conversations, we have agreements. And so I think the two that I had two today.
Okay, all right.
As we talk about microaggressions, is think about impact over intentions.
Okay.
Because when microaggressions happen, people are like, well, I didn't mean it.
Yeah.
Yeah, we know. Like, we're not thinking that people are bad. People make mistakes, but the impact is still there. And that's what we want to deal with. And that's what we want to talk about. And that also thinking about restorative justice, that no one is disposable in these conversations. So even if microaggression happens or even a macroaggression happens, that we're in community together. And that means we're going to deal with it together. It's not going to be a punishment. That's not going to be our default and push you out or ban you. Like, we're going to bring you in to make amends and to restore the relationship and to have justice and not just punishment.
I love that already. All right. Okay, good. So we've got two agreements that we're going to be accountable for and noticing our impact, not just our intention. And we're going to strive for restorative justice, which is outside of the white dominant culture that loves punishment, exclusion, seclusion, and really think about, even if we do make a mistake, how do we come back together to repair, restore, and all that good stuff. All right. So Isela, how can we ground ourselves as we have formed this safe space to have this conversation? And then go ahead and take us right into today's topic, as Ijumma mentioned, about microaggressions.
Okay, so as Ijumma was talking, one of the things that happened within me, and I kind of imagine this happening with folks as they engage in this, I don't know, say it's a conversation, but in our dialogue, right, as they're listening, is that, we can get in a reactive state because it's like we want to go to that place of defending ourselves. I'm not racist. Like, I'm not a bad person, right? Are you saying I'm a bad person? And so we start to get in that freak out place. And I think taking that breath and saying my mantra when I get in that place, because, sometimes things will trigger that for me, I will say, I am safe. I can do this. I can do this. I'm safe and I can do this. And if you're starting to have that experience of are you saying that I'm a bad person? Are you saying that I am, what are you implying here about me? Really kind of lean into that experience and say to yourself, I am loved. I am loved. I am loved. And it opens our hearts, I think, and allows us to receive the message and to allow us to kind of sit with that a little bit. And that's part of the process of growing and changing. You have to be willing to sit in the discomfort.
I really am glad you brought that one up because, and I know we're going to go to the topic, but this is going to be super important for any of the special educators. In my mind, just fast forwarding where I think our conversation might go, microaggressions aren't just around race and culture, and there's all the different identities, especially for any marginalized groups, and you'll help us explain this in a minute, I know better. However, I think sometimes when my colleague Julie Costin and I talk to special educators about inclusion and dismantling old ideas about what is normal and what is a deficit, and how we have this old-fashioned way of looking at disability. People go, oh, I must be a bad person because I have written IEPs, or I've said you're 2 standard deviations below the mean, or have a self-contained classroom. So that's going to be important, Isela, for special educators to know that this is not saying that they are bad, or that because I'm a special educator, but that I have to be aware, but I can lean into it and saying, I am safe, I am loved, and that will let me hear the message.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. So one of the things that came up for me when I was really thinking about this particular topic, for me, it stems from my name, because my entire life, which is really interesting because I went to a school where it was predominantly Hispanic kiddos.
Okay.
And my name couldn't be said by most of the teachers. Now, I don't think it's a hard name. Really, Isela, not very hard. Let's put it together.
Frontczak. I mean, what the heck?
But it was, it was called Miss Garcia or Isela, Isela. And there wasn't, or at least it didn't feel to me that there was an experience of trying to even learn my name.
Okay.
Or when I would say, someone else would say for me, because I just became, it was just the norm. Like, oh yeah, people just call me whatever they call me, and I just respond to anything remotely close to
a close approximation, and you're there.
And so someone would say, that's not her name. Like a friend of mine would say, that's not her name. Her name is Isela. And then the teacher would say, oh, Isela, that's what I said. I'm like, oh, that's not what you said. And then I even had a teacher say to me, well, if your parents would have named you a name that we could all say, you wouldn't have this problem. And I was like, what is that? And so as a kid, you don't even really think like that's the norm, right? You adopt that belief that that's just the way that it is. So when the term microaggression, the first time I ever heard that, because the other thing I used to get was, what are you? What are you? Because you don't speak you don't talk like a Mexican. Like, what are you? And I got that a lot. And so it's like those kinds of things. When I heard I'm like, oh, there's a name for this? Like, because it was an undercurrent, a feeling of that's just not right, or there's something wrong with that. But I didn't have a name for it, or I didn't even just the understanding that there was something that shouldn't be done, right? We just accept it as that's just the way that it is.
Well, let's maybe define for a second, because one of the things I was doing to prepare, and I bet, Ijumma, you have very similar stories around pronunciation, and even Isela and I say your name differently to this day, and she says it's okay however you want to, right? So I want you to speak a little to that. But it was interesting, so maybe you can both share how you define microaggressions. I think it's one of those troubling words because the word micro, just kind of like self-regulation, we think kids have to self-regulate versus co-regulate because of the word self. So micro seems like, oh, it's small, it's not that bad, it's not going to have that big of an impact. But look at Isela's story. To this day, she has this memory of this feeling. But I also saw micro assaults, micro insults, and micro invalidations. So I don't have to talk about those right now, but I think it's interesting, the word micro and the word aggressions, and yeah. So Ijumma, do you want to piggyback or go to define it a little bit?
So when we talk about microaggressions, usually we're talking about interpersonal, and that's what makes it micro, versus when it's systemic, that's usually a macro, that's happening on a bigger scale. So it's not that the impact is small, it's because it's usually just one-on-one, an interpersonal relationship, one person doing something to another person versus systemic, or a group doing something to another group. So when I talk about microaggression, that's the way that I talk about it, and that's the understanding that I have. That the impact varies, right? But it's not because it's a small impact. It's because it's an interpersonal, and so it's a microaggression between these two people. So the teacher saying that to Isela, is part of that, like a microaggression happened to Isela. And on a larger scale, systematically, is upheld because the teacher is the person with the power. And so usually the person that's doing the microaggressions is the person with power, and the system helps them and upholds them and validates them doing it to someone else. So there's usually not a real consequence to that.
Right.
And that's what like we want to talk about, and that's part of what we want to change. That the system doesn't hold that.
Can you speak to, because I think you can do it better than I can, the implicit bias that comes through? Can you speak to that a little bit?
So usually the microaggression is a manifestation of implicit bias. And so implicit bias are unconscious bias. And we don't know that until we say something or do something and someone tells us, right? So a lot of times we think, because it's those words get thrown around implicit bias, and we're going to cure, like I just like looked it up recently, like, oh, we're going to cure people's implicit bias. But actually, that's not how it works, because it's unconscious. And we can't deal with it until it becomes conscious. But in that, there's harm done. Right. And so you don't know until someone you're in relationship with says something about it.
And so I want to build on that for a second, Ijumma, because when you say it's unconscious, I also think some definitions of microaggressions is that it's commonplace. So that is where that you were saying, like, it's just kind of the norm, which we'll come back to the word norm. It was also interesting that microaggressions are things that we say, but they're also things that we do, or an interaction, or environmental. So I want to come back to environmental as well, because I was thinking about like signs in the way school buildings are organized, decorated, labeled, as well as even things like rules that are posted. But I'm also thinking just about in the community where, Ijumma, you and I talked about this like months ago about the White House Black Market store. And so that might be a really interesting example for many to take it outside of like, oh, I have these biases that I'm unaware of, to like at a macro level, they're everywhere in the signage, in the way we design magazine covers, in the way we label food, how and where we organize food in grocery stores, right? Would you agree?
Yeah. I have recently Burt's Bees, people that make like the lip gloss.
Yes.
They had a controversy over the holiday season, because usually they offer family pajamas. And so they had multiple family compositions, but all those families were white or people of color, non-Black people of color. And the one Black family they had was a single mom with 2 girls. And all the other ones, like not only were they heteronormative and having 2 parent families, but then the only Black family they had was and it got all the way to print, right? They were using that as advertisement, and no one said anything until it went to social media and people started to complain, and then they had to backtrack. And that's how implicit bias works, right? That no one even notices. That's just the norm.
Right.
That's stereotype, what Black families are, single moms with like a couple of kids. And that's just who they are. And that's just the stereotype. And no one, right? And probably the people that were the models didn't know that that's how it was going to be. Because they're thinking, oh yeah, like I got this job. They're trying to, be diverse. And then when you put it all together, there's the stereotype.
Gotcha.
Do you remember in the state of California when they were identifying what or explaining what 6 feet, like 6 that you remember? Do you remember that came out? What was it, like produce in Spanish? Was that what it was?
Yeah. It was like weird. Like produce, and it was like it was a taco and burrito one,
Yeah.
Um,
Like, what does 6 feet look like? And so the Spanish translation was like produce carts or like those wood containers. That's what 6 feet looks like. And then for the one in English had like pool noodles or something.
Yeah.
It was. I was like, how did that go to print? Like, really? How did that? Didn't someone say there's something wrong with this picture?
But I think that's
Because
what
that's
the
how
answer is,
works.
because
Like
it's such the
stereo.
norm, right?
Yeah.
It's like so commonplace, and the people in power don't see it as a problem because they can resonate with, or that it upholds their unconscious beliefs anyway. So it doesn't seem like a disconnect.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, we lost her. We'll add her back. So continue your story, Isela, because you were saying like that's what made you think of this in microaggressions, and we've given some recent examples. But tell us more about like why this topic and where we're going with it.
When I was in my undergrad work, I want to share this poem because I think it's an important
that's
one.
right. Okay,
I've got to pull it up.
Yeah.
It was written. It's written by Carmen Tafoya. And it was in my, oh, there we go. Hi, Ijumma. Oh, am I the only one?
Still there? I'll let you read the poem and then we're still right here with you. Okay.
All right. Awesome.
Okay.
It's called In Memory of Richie by Carmen Tafoya. First day of school for both of you. One of you 6 and glowing copper, running with eagerness and proud. The other 22, young teacher, eager for this school. Your blue eyes warm to his brown stars as you both chat and share your missions. As you ask him his name, he rolls it like a round of wealth and deep in Spanish tones responds, Richie. You try to imitate, say, Richie. No, he teases confident. It's Richie, just like this. You notice that each syllable could rhyme with C and try again. He pats you on the back. You go on to your separate tasks, he to his room, you to yours. One day, 6 hours, really not a speck of sand in all this shore of time, and yet so crucial. As you gather papers, turn to flee the cell and gain some comfort in some other place. Your ray of hope comes filtering down the hall. In eagerness for someone's warmth, you shout and wave, hey, Richie! And he corrects, the light and wealth all gone from his new eyes. No, Richie. And for me, I think that culturally, like, I think so much when I walk into schools, the schools don't tell me the story of who the community is, who the children are. And that's really, it's a sad statement. And as I go through this, as I would travel through the state of Arizona, when I had a contract to help kind of redefine kindergarten, I would go into schools and I wouldn't know where I was. Like in South Phoenix, I should know where the culture of the community, right, should be on the walls and in the experiences of the school. And far too often it's not. And so this really, really resonated with me just because of the name thing, but also from that cultural part of how often we just accept this as what's right, you know,
and if I may, Isela, you know, I think what is so heartbreaking still and such a human right issue for the disability community is that because we still have self-contained classrooms, maybe we have separate buses, we might have separate buildings, we might have separate entries, we may have separate rooms, separate teachers, separate recesses, separate playgrounds. It's like it is visually obvious that you aren't the same as the rest. So I feel like there's both of those storylines. There's this sort of whitewashing, and I'm sort of using that maybe purposefully there, of the community. And you couldn't tell how they are from, you know, southeastern Phoenix versus Cleveland, Ohio, which is appalling. But then there is this obvious separation and segregation when it comes to ability.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And so what might that look like specifically, Kristie? So like what might that look like in a classroom or where teachers aren't even aware that they're doing that they're doing anything wrong, right? Because it's something that we've always done.
Well, I think it's like just big things, like when a kid has a big, strong emotion and we send them out, or we do a room clear, or we send all of these very public messages that you don't belong here. And I think it's small things like, hey, Ijumma, Miss Maria's here, and Miss Maria's a speech therapist. Now Ijumma goes with Miss Maria.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's even like Julie and I were talking the other day, and I remember in the 3rd grade that, and I love to read, and I was like on a yellow tracking, and I know purple was the highest, but I know that I wasn't on the highest level of reading. So even on the which color of book I was handed, there was some way of saying you aren't as good as the others. And I know that's different than what we're talking about in terms of cultural biases and the white dominant culture. However, the dominant culture is also able-bodied. And so a lot of our ideas come from people who aren't neurodiverse, trying to interpret the world. And we just do things like, oh, it's time for your therapy. Oh, it's time to go to, your self-contained classroom for a while. And we don't think there's anything, because we just do it all the time. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
So what do you think about either of those?
And Ijumma, what are your perspectives in terms of what this might look like in a program, in an early childhood program,
right,
or even in a school?
I think from like just the beginning of saying children's names, like how a lot of times, especially in California, how like we anglize children's names,
yes,
or give them nicknames when that's not the name that they have. Or sometimes, like when children come from homes that give them nicknames to use in public, then teachers are like, no, you have to use the name that's on this paper. Yeah. And thinking about like our interactions of who do we think are the good children, and how colorism and racism and ability, those intersection of identities. So we automatically think that Black children are not as intelligent, and that Black children are automatically should be pushed into self-contained special ed classes, that the system upholds that, and teachers uphold that unconscious bias and make rules and create environments for that to happen. That in those microaggressions and our implicit bias, like who's the bad kids are usually the children of color, or the children that have Spanish or Mandarin or Arabic as their first language, and it's not English. So we automatically think that they're not, like we talk loud to them or we talk too slow to them.
And I always say, Ijumma, on that comment, for kids who do not yet have verbal communication, especially students who may type to talk, we automatically see them as a slow learner, or not having as much to contribute, or just an amazing, amazing world of ideas, and because they don't talk. Right. And so whether it's English, it's even, I think, compounded if your mode of communication is typing or pictures or even sign language.
Right.
And like you said, many of those identities intersect. And so many children have many of those at play: their race, their language. Yeah.
Their
I think
ability.
another piece to this that I've come across a few times now, actually several times, I would say, is gender.
Yeah. True.
It seems to trigger folks big time. About there was one particular child who's transgender, and the school created this hoopla. I mean, they were really upset because he is Kevin. And the principal and the teachers, there's like, that is not your name. That is not your birth name. And and even said that the Department of Education says that we are required to call you. And so the parent reached out to me, and I'm like, there's no rule like that. There's no rule like that. And so it really triggers that whole when it's gender. And I think there are a lot of things that trigger, but this gender issue for a lot of administrators, teachers and stuff, they're like, that is a girl, not a boy. And we don't want to entertain that because it's confusing for all the other children or the safety or whatever. And it's something that's it's coming up a lot.
Yeah. And I think also to know, like when we talk about those intersections, because no one is just living in one identity. Right. And so we always do have to think about how those identities intersect and the hierarchy that's placed, right? So if a child is transgender, like thinking about their other identities, like there are, because we do live in a racial hierarchy, that they are going to be treated worse than a white child.
That's right.
That's transgender. And so I think I want to make sure that we, in our practice, that we don't try to do like this individual and isolate each one, that when we talk about like microaggressions are happening, they're happening on multiple levels, intersecting with multiple identities, and that those things are happening in real time. Yeah. And so it's easier to talk about it, but I'm trying to challenge myself to remember the intersectionality, to remember that we're still working in racial hierarchies, that we're working in the different privileges that I have as a cisgender person, and how those microaggressions are the norm. And I'm not even aware of it until I make that mistake.
This is not a good education example, but it's to your point. So I've been binge watching Survivor. Don't judge me. With my sister. And it was really, I think sometimes if anybody watches Survivor, sometimes they try to make it more about the social lessons that people are learning than it really is, but they like to play those up. And this is an old episode, and there was a conversation between a white contestant and a black contestant. And the white contestant said the black contestant was crazy. And what the black contestant heard was the N-word. This is how they described it during the whole conversation. And what I heard was, y'all don't think there's a problem with calling somebody crazy. Like that is an ability microaggression, using that. You're crazy. You're insane. I'm going crazy today. I'm insane with the amount of work I have. Like we don't even notice that is also a microaggression. So that's not a great example, Ijumma, but it's sort of what you said. Like I can't tease it apart. Even while these two folks were having a conversation about racial microaggressions, they were concurrently doing one about the identity of ability and not aware of it. So even though they were trying to recognize and apologize and sort through the racial one, they were completely oblivious to the ability one. Yeah, and they're always connected, right? Right.
So thinking about the stereotype of the angry Black woman, right? And part of that is around ability, because then like that person is mentally ill. She can't control her emotions. Right. Mm-hmm. So those, they go together.
Well, and then gender also, because you're a woman, right. So you're emotional.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So then what, I had a question there about that, because you talked, I think I went right into the hot-headed Latina, those very sort of stereotypes that occur. So when they happen, okay, so let's talk about when they happen.
Okay.
What then? What would you do or say when you see something like that happening?
So I think it's context, right? So thinking about, if it happens to me, is it going to be safe for me to say something? Right. Do I have any influence and power, or do I just let it go and then, try to get away from it? Do I flee? Mm-hmm. If I'm in a position of power and it happens to me, then how do I say something that invites repair, right? It's not my responsibility to figure that out, but I want to be able to, because I know I do have the power. I might be the leader of this organization. I need to say something and understand the power dynamic, but also like their repair needs to be done. Like people need to know, like, oh, this is a stereotype. This is when what you did was a microaggression, and that's not okay. And
let me give you a more concrete example and see if you guys want to work through it, because a lot of what the work all three of us do is delivering professional development. So sadly, because of my privilege, I had not learned about microaggressions until way too far in my life. And so one of the questions was, as a PD provider, I'm going to be the speaker, or I'm going to be the person with the power. How am I going to protect participants from microaggressions? That was what was put upon me. If you're going to be a speaker, or if I'm going to attend your conference, how are you going to protect me, the attendee, from microaggressions? So kind of play that one out. Will you guys? Like, you're the person that's speaking. There's a microaggression. What do we do to protect folks during the professional development we offer?
So I think part of it is that that is not 100%. Like I can, like I only can do but so much. So one of the things I do is have agreements, right? And think about what, when things happen, what are we going to do about it, and have a plan for it. Right. The other responsibility that I have is to speak on it, is to not let it slide, but also not to do it if it didn't happen directly to me, then I have to deal with it if it happened to someone else, right? And so I might have to stop and take that person aside and talk with them and ask them how they want to handle it. Okay. And so sometimes people just want to have a one-on-one conversation with the person that said something. If it's said in a large group, then a lot of times I'll, in that moment, ask, like, is it okay if I address this? Because this is how I'm feeling about it. Okay. And move from that place. And also letting people know that if something happens out of my earshot or out of my purview, then you still can come and talk to me about it. And maybe like it's all over, but I'll still try to do something to support you and figure out what to do next. And so making myself available for people to say something, because sometimes things happen really fast and maybe they're like in a small group and something happens in a small group and then they don't tell me until, we're packing up going home.
Or you get your evaluations and then
right, or I get the evaluation or they email me later to tell me about something that's happened. So I still have the responsibility. And I usually say, like, if something happens, you can still contact me and tell me and we can talk about it.
And Ijumma, do you say that? And Isela, I want you to speak to this too. So hold on. That because you had some like preventative things that I heard you say, some in the moment things, and then some things that you might revisit as they become to your awareness. So how do you let folks know that? Do you open up your time and explain what microaggressions are? Or do you put it in your emails to folks that, like, how do you help people know that they can come to you and share that these have happened? And then if you witness it, how do you let the group know you're going to call it out?
And so usually, like, when we talk about the agreements, it comes up then. Like if there's a microaggression, or even if I'm the person, right, that needs to be corrected, like feel free to say something to me. And like if you want to say it in a large group, I'm not going to be embarrassed. Like we can talk about it then. If you want to say something to me later about like the language I use or something that I said to someone, you can do that too. Right. I'm not immune from it. Right. Because we're all like thinking about that restorative justice model, knowing that we're all human. We're all going to make mistakes, but that doesn't mean that there's punishment or like, oh, I just give up. Right. I try to make amends and bring it. So
you're publicly shaming people, and now
there won't be any public shaming.
Right.
Can I tell like a quick story?
Yeah.
I was doing a professional development. And someone wrote crossed out some of the words in a word match around race and racism and like put a different word. And so I got that back. And like, for me, I was like I was very triggered and it upset me. And so I asked as the leader of the group, could I like bring it up and get other people's, because I didn't want to shame the person. Like, right. I didn't even know who it was and I didn't want to know, but it did bring up, since we were talking about race and racism, we want to talk about like how that's impacting not only me, but the other people of color in the room. So we did like a bowl and people talked about different things that happened and what they would like to see about it. But later on, like months later, the feedback that they were like, you shouldn't have brought that up because you shamed that person, and that person was very upset, and they want you to know that they didn't mean it like that. And I was like, I never brought up their name. I said, I don't want, even if you know who it is, don't tell me, because it's not about this individual person. Right, and I'm not going to shame or punish, like nothing bad is going to happen to them. Right. And I didn't take it personally. Like, I'm using this as a moment to talk about like microaggressions and the impact that it can have. And even something so simple as crossing out words and trying to change the language. But this organization decided that I was the bad person, that I was unprofessional, even though I asked, right? I didn't just do it. Like, I asked the leader if this is okay for me to bring up. Thinking that they know their group. But that person actually left, and then the other people were like, no, you shouldn't have brought it up. That was so unprofessional, and you shamed that person. I was like, I didn't know. I still don't know who that person is. I never said their name. I said that this happened, and this is how it impacted me. And I know that other people have been impacted by microaggressions, and I just want to talk about it as a large group. And that's what we did.
Okay.
And so I think people, like the example around the transgender child, like people are trying to protect versus actually make a change and uphold and have us have a more just world, right? They want to uphold the status quo, how it always has been. And just be performative, like, yes, I want you to come and talk about race and racism, but
don't really.
Right? Like, I want, this to be a place where everyone is welcome, that we're inclusive, but not if you're not going to be the gender we think you should be. Right? And so thinking about that it happens all the time. And like, no one is immune from it. Like, I'm not immune, even though like I'm a leader, I'm a professional developer. Like, it can still happen to me because of my race and my gender. Yeah. And so like those things are being dealt with, and people with less power than I have, that happens to them. It happens to children. It happens to early educators who are very down on the totem of who we respect as educators. Right. And so thinking about that's what we have to do. If we say that we want a more just world, if we say that we want to be inclusive, then we have to admit that microaggressions are happening and they have a harmful impact. And that not just changing our individual interactions, that we have to change it systemically. That we have to look at these power positions and the power that people have, and that is based in white supremacy, and that has to change. And so microaggressions aren't being upheld and aren't being pushed aside. Thank you for coming to my rant.
I can't capture all these notes. It's so good. So yeah. So, and I know, Isela, you have probably like 8 places you want to jump in on that.
Yeah. So I think the original question was, I'm only kidding. The original question was about what when you're providing professional development, right? Yeah. Like something comes up. So one of the things that I talk about in the very beginning, agreements, yes, but I also talk about cognitive dissonance. So I talk about what happens within us when somebody says something that we don't agree with. And I talk a lot about social and emotional learning, particularly when it comes to trauma. And so I'm going to tell you stuff that you did as a parent that you're going to, and I've literally had people at lunchtime call their grown children and apologize to them Because I'm going to say stuff that you've done for 20 years. And I'm saying, stop that. Because don't do that anymore, because this is why it's not okay. And I'm going to say these things, and you're going to fight. Internally, you're going to fight, and you're going to say, no, that's wrong. My kids turned out fine. My kids in my classroom. You're going to fight against what I'm saying. And that you have to know it's going to happen. And so I talk a lot about cognitive dissonance, and I also talk about confirmation bias. I talk about, we're going to look at something and we're going to find things that in our own slanted perspective, right? What aligns with my beliefs and my practices. And I'm going to ask you to just kind of be aware that you're moving in that direction. With this political climate, what it did for me was it helped me use that as a platform to say, you and I are going to see one situation, and we're going to walk away with a different perspective of it based on the lens that, we're looking for that confirmation that I'm right. That I'm right. And so when someone says something that pushes, like I say, introduce an idea or a concept or whatever, and it triggers someone, right? Someone's like, no, that's not true. I've always done that. And, everything has been fine, and I'm okay. And my kids are fine, and they've gone to Harvard. Can I lean into what you just said? Okay. And so what I do is I ask permission, right? And I said, now let's really talk about the implications of what the language that I'm saying right now, or the language that I'm asking you not to use anymore. Let's really lean into that. And why? Why within you are you holding on to that? And so when someone says, I don't want to know, you can't, and usually I don't get that though. Honestly, usually I get people say, yes, I'm willing to work through this, even in this public setting. Like 98% of the time people are willing. And I think in part that's because I try really hard to make myself vulnerable in the experience, in the room. Like, I'm going to tell you my story, and I'm going to stand here naked, basically. I'm going to stand here and let you know my story, because there's my vulnerability. And for me, it sets the platform for people to, it invites folks to have that willingness to also be vulnerable. So I think that's an important thing when we're really sort of dissecting our belief systems and figuring out how one impacts the other. The willingness, I think, is, as a trainer, as a presenter, the willingness to set that safe place for people to be able to share, I think is important.
And I guess what I'm taking away from like both of you is that as leaders or as directors or as PD providers, that this awareness that microaggressions are happening, they will happen under our watch. We cannot protect the world, that we ourselves will be the perpetrator, the person who does the microaggression. As Ijumma said, we'll make mistakes. And that we just have to take it head on, that we have to be having these conversations. We have to have a process for dealing with them, knowing that sometimes even your best intentions will come back to somebody's still going to be critical. Because I think you're right, Isela. We go through our whole life looking for evidence that we're right, because when we're right, we feel safe. You can call it safe. You can feel it comfort. You can feel it, whatever it is, but we look for evidence to support our existing beliefs.
Absolutely.
And if we're not aware enough of what our beliefs are, then we just let them kind of unconsciously and on autopilot make decisions for us. I brought this one up, this question about PD, because I also wanted to share with folks. So maybe we could do two things. I wanted to share with folks this series that Ijumma is doing this spring. I guess it'll be spring. I don't know, February, March.
Late winter, early spring.
Right, early spring. Around helping us design and deliver professional development and learning that is anti-racist. But let's get a little bit of closure maybe on the microaggressions. I'm thinking back to your poem as well, Isela. So what are the key takeaways for educators wherever their role is. And Ijumma, your point's really well taken, that early educators in that hierarchy are also marginalized. So we're asking people that are, for multiple reasons, on the bottom of hierarchies to take a big risk to do things that are counter the white dominant culture. So what are some of our key tips or takeaways as it relates to microaggressions? And then we'll tell folks a little bit about the series. And Isela, you and I can ask her some questions like, what are we going to learn and who's going to go and how excited we are. So how do we kind of wrap this up for folks?
So I think what I would want to offer is it's to not over personalize, like when you make that mistake, right? That like part of the work is not taking it personal, not going into that good, bad binary that you made the mistake and now you're a bad racist person or now you're ableist, right? Don't take on those labels because that's a distraction to actually dealing with the impact, right? Because what we want is that it's being brought up to give you opportunity to make amends, to make the relationship better. And so thinking about it in that way, thinking about how I can be in better relationship with people. When I let go those stereotypes and when those biases come up, that I say, oh, you know what, that isn't right. And I need to let that go in order to be in better relationship with myself. Because I want to see myself as a person who is inclusive, who is loving and caring, and making sure that the person that I've harmed is better, that I've restored that relationship with them. And that because a lot of times, like training, like when we talk about microaggression, there's a lot of talk around people's discomfort. Yes. Versus like thinking about the impact that it has and how we're actually going to restore those relationships.
Yes. Yeah. I love that phrase, making the relationship better. I feel like so many people are like, it's all about relationships. Relationships are the priority. However, we're talking about education, a lot of lip service, but I love that idea that if your end goal is to make the relationship better, then you can get rid of some of that, my own personal discomfort or my own personal clinging on to, well, I wasn't a bad person, I didn't mean to, or even being so sorrowful that I start to cry, right? And now it's all about me. Okay. Isela?
I think I always go to that place of as an organization. So if I was a director and administrator of an organization, what does this mean for me, right? And for me, it's really about how does this conversation, this topic, how can I bring that into help defining cultural norms? And so what does this look like as an agency, as a group of people who are here to serve children and families? And so I look at what's the language we use, because I think it's really important for me anyway, because I had to learn language. I had to learn how to communicate effectively. I had to learn how to be okay on Monday, like, that we're going to move forward and that we're not going to hold on to the hurt, the pain, and the embarrassment, the stuff that happens when somebody addresses something that I've said or done. And so I would come up with, I think, collectively sit with, whether it's a committee or the entire agency, it's like you have to sometimes start small and then initially bring other folks on board. If you've got an opportunity to bring everyone and have these conversations about what if somebody says something, right? What's the language we use? And it might be, I'm interested in knowing more about that. Can you say more? Or I didn't think about it that way. I had never thought of that as a microaggression. Can you say more about that? What would be better, or I didn't even realize that was a bias of mine. Let's have a conversation about that. Or how do we move forward from here? Like, this has happened, and how do we move forward and be okay in relationship with one another? And then what does this mean for us as an agency? Like, are there other ways that we're seeing this? And so how do we start to create the change that's needed? And so I think having these kinds of this kind of dialogue when something happens, or even having what I call scripts, right, to respond to situations that promote or invite the opportunity to engage in a dialogue is important.
Yeah, it's to couple of things to bring the two of you, your thoughts together. It's like you can't just expect people to know how to do this. So Isela, one of the things I love about you are your scripts, but it's back to Ijumma's point about having a plan. And so we have to be intentional in the PD we provide. We have to be providing professional development and learning to our staff around what are microaggressions, doing a real examination of the environment, our language, our interactions, from our newsletters to how we greet folks, to make sure that we're not doing microaggressions. And I feel like that multiple identities is really important at that point. It's not just saying, oh, we're doing the race or the ability, but looking at the intersect or the concurrent nature of all those identities and the microaggressions that could be occurring, but then understanding the hierarchy within those. And then just for you, Isela, because I know you'll love this, I'm reading that book about badass habits. And she says, your guilt, shame, and shoulds cannot run the show.
I say to folks, stop shitting on yourself.
Right?
Stop shitting on yourself. Yeah.
And I feel like both of you, what you're speaking of is like, get beyond especially for white people, or people maybe that even present as white, or people that aren't comfortable yet speaking up. We can't let guilt, shame, and shoulds run the show. Okay. So if people are interested in learning about these kind of like scripts and to do what, you shared, Ijumma, that you do in your own professional development, and they're going, oh my gosh, I could never do that. Like I would just be like a deer in the headlights. Let's talk to them a little bit about our PD offering. It's called Growing Anti-Racist Communities, a sustainable model for ECE PD providers. So maybe tell us a little bit about it. And then Isela, you and I can ask her a few questions.
So I think sorry, like we created it because there really isn't anything, especially for PD providers that work in early education, right? And there's not a lot of stuff that talks about, well, how do we actually implement or embody being anti-racist in the work that we do? Like there's a lot of stuff about helping educators. It might not be that great, but like there's stuff out there, right? And there might be stuff for directors, but the people that are actually providing the training, that are providing the PD, the people that are coaching other people are encountering a racist system, and they might not actually know how to talk about it or help other people be anti-racist. And it's a big ask, with the racial, with all the racial stuff that's becoming mainstream, that a lot of PD providers, coaches, like they're asked to, okay, so now make us anti-racist.
Right? On top of what we do, and here's another quarter. And I think it comes certain different ways. It could be that a lot of the PD providers are like me and they're white, but the folks that they're supporting may be diverse on other levels, right? Or they could all be white providers, but the families that they're serving and the children and communities. So there's many levels to this. It could also be that we have a diverse staff, but we've never ever talked about why do all of the Black teachers sit on one side of the cafeteria and all the white teachers sit on the other side during a PD offering. Or like in Alaska, many of the indigenous teachers will sit together and all of the white teachers will sit together. And what do I do as a PD provider? Do I say something? I mean, everybody notices it, right? Those kinds of things as well. Isela, what are you thinking about as you hear us talk about this?
I think about what it looks like in terms of teacher interactions with children. And I don't know a whole lot about your planning and what this is going to look like. And
well,
what
we're still making it up. So make your way.
You're still making it up. Okay. But, for me, it's as an administrator, as a director, like, how do I bring this to the classroom and help teachers become more aware of their actions and interactions with children and with families?
Yes.
And I work with a lot of caseworkers. I work with a lot of Head Start programs, right? And a caseworker going into the home, and they've got all of their, those biases that they're completely unaware of in terms of how they engage, where they sit, how they do the work that they do. And so I'm hoping that as you are planning, that those are some of the things that will be, I think, addressed and offered as, to help folks. So what are your thoughts around that, Ijumma?
Yeah. So when I in the past, when I've worked with case workers or home visitors, I'm thinking about what their starting place is. Mm-hmm. So a lot of times we think like, oh, I've been a teacher in the classroom,
right?
And I can go in here and do this, and forgetting that, like, you're not starting from a neutral place. Mm-hmm. Like, you probably have like a script and all this paperwork to do, but it's not from a neutral place. Like, mm-hmm. Culturally, it's based in white dominant cultural norms, right? And a lot of times the families don't fit. And so you have all this cultural conflict that you probably haven't been trained to how to handle. And it might be some internal stuff, because you might have, you've gotten this far. So that means that you know how to code switch, that you've assimilated on some level, but now you're going to a family that you should have some connection with, and probably you don't, because you're coming to say, well, you need to change and fit this mold. Yeah. And that's going to impact how parents are interacting with children. That's going to impact if you're a coach and you're going in the classroom supporting teachers, and you're coming in with that model of thinking about, oh, this is the right way to do it, and not thinking about the different cultural ways of being and the cultural ways that are very important and very valuable to those communities, and how you interact and talk to the teachers, because you want them to talk to the children in a certain way. Like, those are the things that we're going to think about and work through together. So of course I'll offer scenarios, I'll offer, my own stories around it, and people will bring in, because it happens all the time. So no matter your role of working with adults, I think you can find a place to be and learn with us. Mm-hmm. And if there's something, because there'll be a smaller group, so it'll be a lot of more individual things. And one of the things that I hope for is that people bring something to actually work on. So by the end of your time, that you'll either have a starting point or you'll worked on something. So you have a new PD plan, or you have a new form that you want to use. So you actually leave with something. And so we're not, as much as I like to talk about something, that we have something that you can actually work with and continue to think about.
For example, Ijumma, if I'm a service coordinator, I mm-hmm. could think about how I'm doing intake differently with different families. Or if I'm a coach and I'm supposed to get you to do the teaching pyramid or some sort of SEL curriculum, I would use mm-hmm. that lens. Or if I'm a 619 coordinator for the state and I'm writing policies around eligibility for preschool special ed, any of those places we could be thinking about, where are we able to decolonize or be anti-racist, or even to today's topic, protect others from microaggressions. Right?
Yes.
Okay.
So help me understand, because it sounds from what both of you are saying, you are wanting or encouraging folks to make a commitment to show up mm-hmm. rather than sort of a recorded session, right? Watching the recorded session so that they can really participate. So it sounds like this is where folks are really going to be engaged, asked to do some, reflection or some sharing. Okay.
And then it'll always be by invitation. So folks can learn from others that are able and willing to share their examples and stories. And like Ijumma said, she'll share her stories, but we really hope that folks will be ready to be in small groups and ready to bring their issues and community challenges and to work through those.
And how many weeks is this?
5.
5 weeks. Okay. And are they like an hour and a half sessions, or how long is each session?
I think it's an hour and a half. I think that's what.
Like 75 minutes, but it'll probably go an hour and a half, but it'll go so fast. But yeah, there's 75 minutes for 5 weeks. and I'll put the link in the show notes. And there's an overview of each of the 5 sessions. So they start February 2nd. It ends March 2nd. So that's an easy way to think of it. There's kind of bookends of the 2nd of February and the 2nd of March. And they're from like 1:30 to 2:45 Eastern time. So you'll have to help me with the math, you two. But yeah, 75 minutes, 5 times, small group. We're capping it at 30 folks. And these are all folks that are working with young children and families.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Cool.
Well, it sounds like a really cool thing.
I can't wait. I'm just gonna be like, and here's Ijumma. And then I'm gonna go get my notebook and learn. That's my plan.
So
All right.
yeah, so that's the plan. I hope more people join us. It looks like we'll probably have 30.
Yep.
Like,
we're close. We're close.
So I'm excited about it. I'm excited to do this work. Because it's different, because usually people hire me and then I come in with their agenda, and now you get all of my agenda.
Well, here's the benefit of that. I'll tell you, when you kind of have to be at the PD, right? And somebody shows up to teach you, what you're doing wrong, as opposed to what's coming to you. It really is I think an incredible experience, because folks are here like, I really want to learn about this.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And my hope is that this will make a big impact, because these are folks that are directors, are coaches, are PD providers, are at that macro level. And maybe we can start to really dismantle and create great awareness, so that in California, or in Burt's Bees, we don't make it all the way to the ad before somebody goes, hey, this might be a problem. That's my wish for us.
Yeah.
All right.
That we make systemic change. That's always
change
our work.
Yes. Because we're going to get some justice here any day now, right, Ijumma?
Yes.
All right. Thank you both. We will see everyone next week. Next month.
Next week.
Oh, no, sorry. Oh, it may be as close to beer 30. You guys are going to be so proud of me. It's been like I gave up beer for a while. So that might.
I don't know if that's a good idea.
I don't know either. It's like it's in my blood flow at this point.
Oh my goodness.
They're drooling on myself, but yeah. So next month, and I think Ijumma, you'll be up to pick our topic, and we appreciate all your comments and following us on YouTube and in our Facebook group. And we'll see you in a couple of weeks, and then hopefully you'll see Ijumma and me on February 2nd.
Yes.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.